Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 6 of Persians, the podcast. At the very heart of this play, we are faced with a choice. We've talked about how the play was sponsored by Pericles on his way to becoming a major figure in Athenian political history. Perhaps there was encouragement to glorify the city's victory and survival. It's also worth mentioning that the Athenians at Salamis were led by Themistocles, who Pericles may have been eager to support. Did Aeschylus get any encouragement to portray the Persians in a particular way? The play is mentioned as an example in Edward Said's landmark study, Orientalism. It's one of the earliest instances of a European writer inventing a representation of an Asian setting and Asian characters. As we will continue to see, many of the distinctive characteristics of Persian culture in the play are far more Greek than not Greek. As Professor Hall suggested a few nights ago, the play offers an opportunity for Greek audiences to revisit their own grief and sorrow through the lens of their Persian equivalents. But we really need to discuss the politics of this representation. Even if barbarian hadn't quite accrued a few thousand years of negative connotations, there are still plenty of hints about how the Athenians differentiate between Greek and Persian. Persians are lavishly dressed, baroque even, and effeminate. As mentioned last night, there's consistent reference to their new lack of men. They are literally unmanned. Much of this can be understood as a means of highlighting the positive qualities of the Greeks. Professor Edith Hall is the expert on this tension within the play. Her book, Inventing the Barbarian, is a terrific study of how the Greeks defined themselves through drama. I spoke with her about the word barbarian and how it's used in the play, and she gives a surprising but very effective comparison with another theatrical text.
Well, it occurs, I think, 10 times in this play, and when all the characters are actually not Greek. It's very unusual. Most Greek tragedy has encounters between different people of different cities and people of different ethnicities. These are all Persian. It's at the Persian court with the Persian royal family, Persian messengers. That's it. And yet they speak in Greek. It is a slightly coloured form of Greek. Aeschylus manages to give it a sort of oriental tinge by various technical means, but they actually do refer to each other as we barbarians, which is pretty uncomfortable if you're trying to actually put this play on now in any language. You've got to face how are you going to translate this word. Because originally the word barbarian in Greek really does just apply to language. It means people who sound as though they're going bar, 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 and we can't understand what they're saying. The people like the rhubarb. It doesn't, it only gradually, because of the Persian Wars, and because the barbarian, if you said the barbarian, Barbaros, the single barbarian, you always meant the great Persian king. You know, he was the consummate barbarian. So it was during the Persian Wars that all the other associations of the Persian monarchy in the Greek imagination, being despotic, being very materialistic, being very ornamental, being very ceremonial, very hierarchical, and indeed more moral qualities like very cruel and effeminate and cowardly. Those sorts of stereotypes started to adhere to that term. So it's very peculiar indeed to sit and contemplate what the Athenian audience sort of made of it. Maybe they didn't bat an eyelid. It was perfectly, maybe they felt it was perfectly natural that these guys who were barbarians would call each other barbarians. We know that the Persians didn't call themselves barbarians. They called themselves all kinds of things, Chaemenids and Persians and Medes. They didn't call themselves barbarians. And I'm afraid this is where it reminds me more than anything of the Mikado. I'm really serious. This idea that you sort of have some names that sound vaguely Japanese, and you know a very small amount about Japanese culture and Japanese costumes and Japanese ceremonial titles, but you do it all in Victorian English. You know, that's the kind of, I'm afraid, register that I think we've got to get into, but it's obviously not meant to be funny all the way through.
This Greek construction of what the Persian court was like was a dramatic invention. We don't know how much evidence Aeschylus might have had.
They knew very, very little about what really went on inside the Persian court. I mean, it was a secretive court, but very few people had actually ever visited it, certainly from Athens. I think actually the Eastern Greeks who did live in those cities on the what's now the Turkish western coast, they knew an awful lot more. They must have done because they were living cheek by jowl with them. And there are some signs of real ethnographic sort of knowledge in the play. The list of proper names, for example, which is so evocative, right from the beginning, like these roll calls of the dead, and in one of the messenger speeches, creates, I think an awful lot of those names were real, but they knew who they'd killed, they knew the names of the commanders of the boats, and so on. So I think that there's quite a lot of authentic colouring comes through with things like proper names. But fundamentally, the play is about defining Greek ideals, about what it is to be a good Greek, by portraying a kind of opposite. So the Greek ideal male is brave, intelligent, self-disciplined, and abstemious. This is the ideal ancient Greek for himself, and very masculine. So he creates a fantasy other in the Persians, which was cowardly, irrational, over-emotional, effeminate, very sort of unjust and cruel. I mean, we hear that Xerxes made threats to behead all his lieutenants if they put a single foot wrong. No Athenian democrat would take that from, any kind of government, that you had an arbitrary despot who just said off with your heads. So the picture is very much built up to flatter the Greeks' own self-identity.
Academics and thinkers have, in recent years, been arguing about how to take this representation of the Persian other. Here's Professor Oliver Taplin with quite a balanced perspective.
There has, in recent criticism of the Persian, I mean, I'm talking about within the last 20 years, been a great split, really, between some scholars who say this is a triumphalist play. This is the victors humiliating the defeated. And they're partly picking up on the idea of Orientalism, that somehow this play was the very first example of European denigration, disparagement of the East, because here are the Greeks showing the Persians to be useless and weird and uncivilized. That's the kind of triumphalist interpretation which is held by respectable scholars. And the other extreme, you get people who say, oh no, this is the most amazing act of deep, humane empathy with the defeated. Now, I'm very much not in agreement with the first one. This play quite clearly seems to me isn't triumphalist. Its power lies in imagining what it's like to be defeated. At the same time, the Persians are not represented as just like us Greeks. They're not represented as being free from fault. Their defeat is not represented as undeserved. So it's not a purely pure exercise in humane empathy either. But that has been it's amazing how polarized those two views still are, even today.
And for reference, it's worth hearing too from our Greek expert on the play, Lydia Koniordou.
It's not nationalistic. It's part of the Greek identity through the times, through the ages. There is an element of the Greeks which you can call heroic, that they will not give up even if they die for it. And that explains of these unexplainable otherwise results of Marathon and of the Salamis.
It would have been very easy for Aeschylus to write a big, ebullient play about how weak and ridiculous the defeated Persians must be. But he doesn't do that. Even amid the various negative qualities that Edith listed, they remain articulate, they are certainly not stupid, and they do gain our sympathy. Surprisingly, he makes us listen to the list of the Persians who died at Salamis, as the audience can see it in the distance. Aeschylus seems determined that our experience be a nuanced one. There is no room for rabid nationalism or jingoistic triumphalism, since he quietly but deliberately makes us understand the Persians and their losses. There is, of course, a little national pride to be had. At the point where we stopped last night, the Persian messenger is describing the outbreak of the day's conflict. The character is an eyewitness. We should also bear in mind that Aeschylus was himself a veteran of Marathon and presumably saw what happened on that fateful day 2,500 years ago. The next few lines, spoken in perfect Greek by our Persian messenger, are very conceivably verbatim, calling to us from the past. Onward, sons of Greece, freedom for your fatherland, freedom for your children, for your wives, for all the shrines dedicated to the faith of your fathers, for the tombs of your ancestors. Today we fight for all of them.
A vic nang reigach, tenagi adiv, aga seragi vor dir ruchish, seragi vor lianavi, vor mana, shinana vor neha duchish, agas uigana vor shinshish. Is a son ille ata an criviscad shul fui lahish.
Every time I've seen this play performed in Greek, this little section has had a round of applause. Even this summer, in the unusual circumstances necessitated by the pandemic, it got a flutter of applause from the reduced audience in Epidaurus. Nothing like the nationalist cheers it might have had in the past. Perhaps this speech is itself a barometer of contemporary political pressure. This tiny quotation from the battleships is stirring, and it's as jingoistic as the play gets. 8 years after the battle, Aeschylus puts it on stage, within a frame of Persian, not Greek, experience. Maybe this is a very extreme example, but it's something akin to imagining Nazi experience on stage in Poland in the early 1950s. In a slightly wider context, it's worth noting that Greek tragedies really don't tend to take place in Athens. They're always in Thebes, or Argos, or Troy, or somewhere else. They take place at considerable distance, and frequently they put the less important members of society on stage: women, slaves, foreigners, old men, and even children. Athens used the representation of these others to reflect itself. Shakespeare did the same thing. He never set his plays in England unless they were at a historical remove, but behind all of his plays there's a sense of examination, as though the theatre is questioning the society that produces it. The same happens in Athens, and certainly is happening in our play. What makes it so extraordinary is that Aeschylus manages to elicit any sympathy for the Persians. One could, if one were obstinate enough, see only the glory of Greece written into this text, but what makes it a marvel for me is this other possibility. Even if he tempers it with a jolt of national pride, Aeschylus continues the messenger's speech with a depiction of what followed. We can feel good for the Greeks in that moment of valiant bravery, wherein they steel themselves to take on an armada that outnumbers them 3-1. But the description that follows is quite brutal. Again, for the sake of the sound and the flow, I won't interrupt the whole speech. Things move quickly after the Greek battle cry. The ships begin to ram into each other, and the conflict escalates until there are so many corpses that the sea is invisible beneath them. The messenger laments that a full catalogue of these disasters would be impossible, even if he took 10 days to try to list them.
Láiseach baun the bhfuil lung a rob cré ua a gunne baid eile. Hasnig átach gréigach ag dunga baid agus fris sé an nuas tá sach umalán de lung perseach. Gach captain a dírig a ling a gunne an duine eile. Dúis da chuir tuile mór an orsa ferseach suas bach Ach leis an ide a go bhí dingethe le chéile sa cail taní ní ráidir ábalta hacht I gáir a chéile. Agus do bhúladar a chéile lena gobanna cré ua, agus do bhrisidar an ferras rábhíochta. Tháinig na lunga gréigecha timpeall ortha go cuaramach. Agus deradar a muile agus casag tóinecha na lung suas síos, agus ní fada ná bhéadfá ráir go áil ar a bharige, is í líanta le lunga briste agus le daoine marabha. Bhí na cóstaí agus na scedanne a chuid thar míl le corpáin. Chluis gach lung lé ag éalú gan ord na aigis. Gach lung nóid a chaulach na marbarach. Ach de bhuailedar agus de smitadar sin le madí rábha briste agus le blautracha den long bhrise. Fuoi mar ba rá éisc sin. Ag an am chéana líon gáthí agus luine an airige go léir go dtí gur thug súil doracha na híthe an eachtara chun deirig. Fiú tá gaithinn de lá a go bhailt tríd, líne líne. Ní éithinn insint umaláán a thuirt líon dabistí. Mar is féidir bheith cinnte dhé. Na maidí a gúríomh an irid san fearr éon lá a bhain.
The Queen is understandably distraught, horrified at the news of so many Persian deaths. She asks how this can have come about. The messenger describes how things began to go wrong in the waters of Salamis, and how it dawned on Xerxes just how badly he was going to lose.
Tá Ealaíon os cóir Salamis, Ealaíon beag gur dachar lunga a chur ancada ann, áite haníon an dia pan, ag rinke fanna góstaí. Chur Xerxes na fíorse I dír ann, chun gur oside a bharódís an fórsa náidir gréigach, nuair a bhrisfí a lungana, is go nenhadís an Ealaíon chun slánathe agus chun a gumrádathe a héire ó chéalan an na fadige. Ba bheag I hiig sé cad a bhí chun thar-lú. Mar an lá chéana gur thugann dia an buas a chafaige das na gréigig, dáiscadar suas a gurp faoi adam cré ua. De lémadar dá lunga agus a himplíadar an Ealaíon go léir. Chunach raibh is ag na fíorse gine chá chasadís. Bhuaileag go mion minic iad le clocha, caite ag lábhan an réagach, agus leag sayada ó bhawana iad agus de Maria iad. An son aige deire, de déna gréigig ina gine le héan ráid catha a bhain agus bhuailiad, agus dhéan bústéireacht dhéage bochta na bhar go dtí nar an dé na betha ionta. Do chuin Xerxes os ard nuair a chunig sé méid na hanachinne. Mar bhí siach an aige le ráirt ma umaláán an áid, fort ard os cion na mara. Da strach sé a róbí ó na chéile, agus da luig sé os ard ag olagón go fada bug bín. Agus thug ordúdas na cosisithe a bhí ag tethe iníg an nanaman gan ord, gan agad.
In the final portion of the messenger's catalogue of woe, he describes how those who didn't die in the waters attempted to make their way back home. It's a desolate speech, in which it seems even the natural world is turning hostile. There's fire and ice and hunger and thirst. The Persians have attempted to yoke the seas, and they have failed, and now many of them die on the journey home. They have been thoroughly, totally defeated.
Caitríona lung a bhí fáca. Heithir de leoga mar agus faoi bhí agar le cóirt fa gaithe. An Comhairle an bhórsa, thos níidir a fáil bháis I ddír bó íthia, chuidecha spiúnta den dart agus iad a tnú le fíor isce ó faoinsí gléinecha. a Hiladín larag ar an áile. Dhéanamar ar slí trí hírt fó se, agus trí halamh daras an nuas go dtí bá bhelia. Áit in iscían an speisias an machade lena dá iscí. As son, agus sin stúcathe le hocaras, hánamar go má an talamh achiach agus go caharach na sasáile. Fuair ar bharamór bás an son le hocaras agus le tart, mar bhí an dá rud ann go rábach. Hánamar go Magnésia agus go tír Macedónia, go há an Axios agus go dtí bugach bolba faoi na dheolcaig agus go sléomh Pangaeon I dalamh na Nedanach. Dia na híthe, de chrathaigh sé dhírig I gmeacht I gcuine na sé súr. Sa slí is go róigh áha nafa straimán fanna aid. Iad siúd nach raibh tar éis puin tora ó thuirte na déthe go dtí seo. Da léadar ortha I baidracha, agus dú léadar síos os cór na talúna agus na spéire. An son nuair a bhí a ornathe chun na déthe críochnathe ag an airm, thos níadar ag tras nó an lic ail facáilte. Cuideagain, a rá trasna go tapig sa ar scap gahan na dia na gréin a hartféin áit thugamar na cosa lín, mar ciorcail geall na gréine. Nuair a thosa sí a sáilsiú go teile na gahanna de dhéon sí tine den gosáin agus chuir páil trí na lár. Hit na fear mark ar a chéile, agus bhí an seansló siúd go imig an dé asta go tapig. An drong a bhí fácathe, ní ar mhórán iad. Táid ar a slí ag tethe go dtí tailigh I tíre dúchais, tar éis go bhailt tríd an tráis le mór chuid dua. Is é seo an údó broin atá ag chathair na Perseach, atá ag tnú lena ír óga inúna. Tá na nithe seo fír. Ach fágan minsint amach cuiomh tis na hanróití a dagar na déthe ar na Persiig.
With that, the messenger departs, and the Queen and the chorus again have to decide what to do. I hope you'll join us again tomorrow night when we'll see what they do next. Persians, the podcast, is written and presented by me, Conor Hanratty, and of course our beautiful Irish translation is by Ealaíon Ní Mhurchú. Tonight you heard contributions from Edith Hall, Oliver Taplin and Lydia Koniordou, and the performance of The Messenger was by Caitríona Ní Mhurchú. Our signature music is by Mel Mercier, and the show is produced by Maura O'Keefe. The show is coming to you as part of Dublin Theatre Festival 2020, and we're supported by the Arts Council. Be sure to follow us on social media with the handle @PersiansDTF, and you can find more information about the show at persiansthepodcast.com.